I'm a journalist by trade, and I guess the job is making sense of stuff. While it's still happening, you don't know how it's going to come out, and very frequently you don't know all the facts. In fact, you never know all the facts. Sometimes even the ones you think you know turn out to be lies later on, because people lie to you a lot. But it's an interesting job, and eventually, if you do it long enough and you keep your eyes open, you begin to put the pieces together. And the topic today is nonviolent revolutions, but that's where we're going to start. I may end up a little bit further down the road than that, but start with that, and here's the thought. We are all accustomed to violence, if not personally, at least we see it, and we have a kind of standard. I don't think we're always aware of it, because we all accept that some kinds of violence are, if not justifiable, inevitable and unsurprising, like a bar fight. Right? And you don't go around casting blame. You know, there was provocation, there was counter-provocation, somebody threw the first punch. The next thing you know, the two idiots are scrambling around on the floor amid the broken glass. And in the end, nobody's much messed up about it. It's something that happened. It's unfortunate, but there you go. On the other hand, if you happen to be walking down, let's say, the corridor in your school, and somebody comes along and smashes you in the face without saying good morning first, you may feel a little bit put upon. You may feel that that was out of order, that it's unjustifiable. There's no way you could possibly defend that action. Now, what's this got to do with nonviolent revolution? Well, think about it for a moment. Back in 2 years ago when the Tunisians first went out on the streets, or about a year and a half ago, almost 2 years now, when the Egyptians followed them out onto the streets, and similar things began to happen in other parts of the Arab world, what we saw, and some of us are old enough to have seen it in other places at earlier times, was a bunch of people, mostly young people, going out in the public square, defying the government, indeed demanding that the regime cede power, go away, go home, hand over the keys, firmly, but politely, and completely non-violently. They didn't throw a brick or a bottle. They didn't offer any threats to the cops or the police or the army or whoever was confronting them in the street, the forces of, as they say, law and order. But they didn't go home either. Now, here's the question. These regimes, Mubarak in Egypt or Ben Ali in Tunisia or so on, have a lot at stake here. They've been running this country for 20 years. Their family have got rich. They've got enormous amounts of money stowed away abroad, but they don't really want to leave. They want to stay in power. And if they don't clear the streets, if they don't get these kids off the streets, they're going to lose power. I mean, it will not happen right away, but every day that they cannot assert control over the center of their own cities, their ability to intimidate people is decreasing, their credibility is bleeding away, and of course the economy, the cash flow, is starting to run out. The economy's not turning over. So they've got to clear the square. Why don't they just machine gun these guys? I mean, they've got machine guns. They've got everything they could possibly want, a huge amount of force at their disposal, and yet they don't use it. They will use little bits of violence, and if you happen to be the person that it is applied to, you may end up dead. I mean, for example, Tahrir Square in Egypt, at night it was quite interesting. The behavior of the crowd was rather like, I don't know if you ever watch A School of Fish, but what the fish tend to do is to try to get into the middle of the school and not be out on the edges, because that's where the predators pick you off. And very similar things, dynamics were operating on that square, particularly at night, because off the square in the alleys around it, there were usually government-backed bought gangsters who would surge out from time, grab somebody from the edge of the crowd, drag him down the alley and give him a kicking, might kill him. There was 860 people killed in the Egyptian Revolution in 3 weeks. Not one of them was a soldier, and only 1 or 2 were cops. Everybody else was an unarmed protester. So it's not that the government's afraid to use force, it's afraid to be seen using unjustifiable, unprovoked force. Partly because that puts it beyond the pale, even with the large proportion of the population who are sitting on the fence. Do we dare defy the government? But, I mean, they're so scandalously evil. Look what they just did, massacred people in the square. That could be the end of the regime right there. And there's another question, which is, what if we order the soldiers to kill the kids and they don't obey? I mean, if the kids are throwing bricks and bottles at them, the soldiers are all juiced up, they feel like they're defending themselves, of course they'll obey the order to open fire. But if the kids are just standing there, saying, "We want our rights, sir," and you order them to start shooting the kids, they may not obey. After all, who are they? I mean, they're young men who are about the same age and probably from the same social classes as the kids in the square. It might be their sister out there or their brother. And if you ask them to open fire without any provocation, they may decide not to, in which case they have committed mutiny, which is a death penalty offense in most armies, and their best avenue of safety now is to take their guns, turn them around the other way, and shoot their officers. So nonviolence, while it is not nice, is very effective tactically. It prevents the state from using the enormous amount of force at its disposal. It can use little bits in the dark, but it cannot use everything at its disposal unless the protesters are foolish enough to go violent, which, by the way, is what happened in Syria. The Syrian catastrophe that's happening now began to unfold in a very large way after some deserting soldiers who joined the protesters but didn't quite understand the rules of the game began shooting at the government troops, ambushing convoys, things like that. Up to the point where that happened in October of last year, 3,000 Syrians had been killed. It's now 30,000. They're using artillery in the middle of the city. They're using airstrikes on Syrian cities. There are no off-limits actions anymore because essentially the protesters, or the deserting soldiers among them, gave the government license to use massive force by using some force themselves, provocation. So nonviolent revolution is remarkably successful provided you've got the right discipline. I mean, it's not just what's happened to the Arab world now. We have 26 years, a chain reaction of nonviolent revolutions that have brought democracy to countries in every continent. It began with the Filipino uprising against the dictator Marcos in 1986. Why there, why then? I think that why there was because there were Filipinos who had gone to school in the States during the 60s and had actually seen the American civil rights movement and how that tactic worked in a much more benign environment. They weren't trying to overthrow the U.S. government. The U.S. government wasn't going to machine gun them. But they saw these tactics in action and then put them into application, into effect in the streets of Manila with extraordinary effect. They won. And the regime vanished, and the dictator Marcos walked out the back door, got on the helicopter, and went abroad to live with his money. So that happened when it happened because I think you now had, for the first time, live uplink to satellites on television. So when people went out in the streets in Manila, the government could not kill them without everybody seeing it. Suddenly, this will be a public action. It cannot be hidden. And so the government is twice deterred. And in the subsequent, 3 years? You had copycat nonviolent revolutions in South Korea against the generals who ran the country there, in Bangladesh, in Thailand. Observe. One size fits all. Doesn't matter whether you're Muslim like Bangladesh, or predominantly Catholic like the Philippines, or Buddhist like Thailand, or deeply confused like South Korea, which is a bit Catholic, a bit Protestant, and a good deal Buddhist. It works every time, and oddly enough, all of these very different cultures and histories bring people to the same point where they want the same things. They're not copying the West, they want it for their own purposes. So we have an extraordinary technique here, a revolutionary technique that doesn't involve blood all over the walls and is actually more effective, statistically speaking, more effective than the traditional violent revolution. Much better hit rate in terms of results. They win more often, and when they win in a nonviolent revolution, they're far more likely to succeed in transiting to a democracy rather than a new dictatorship run by a bunch of thugs from the Revolutionary Army. Now, all of this being said, why is there this universal, or apparently universal, desire to get rid of the hierarchy, the dictatorship, the forceful repression of most individuals' liberties? I mean, many people in the United States, for example, think that it's all because they had a revolution like that 200 years ago and everybody else wants it. But no, that's not the case. I think people do want it, but it's not because the Americans did it first. So let me pull focus all the way back and talk about the biggest picture you can think of in terms of why this is happening the way it is happening now. Until 10,000 years ago, about, all human beings lived in societies that were equal, egalitarian. Not democratic, you didn't need to vote, there was only about 50 adults in your band, you could all sit around and discuss what's going to happen together and come to a conclusion, but everybody had the right to talk, and everybody could talk as often for as long as they wanted. You want to see this in action, go and watch a native Canadian band make its decisions. Life's most boring activity. It'll take days, they'll all say it 20 times, but they will get there in the end, and they don't even have to hold a vote, and everybody is equal. This is the way human beings lived, all human beings, until the rise of civilization. Equality was the rule. And I think it's probably entrenched very deeply in our thinking process, but possibly even taped into the genes of the species. We are an egalitarian species. So what the hell happened? Why after 10,000 years ago, all of a sudden the world turns into a place where virtually everywhere is a monstrous tyranny? As soon as you get agriculture, mass civilization, large numbers of people, there's a god king, there's warriors around him, there's peasants, there's slaves, women's status collapses. All of this everywhere for thousands of years. And yet this species, always before, this human species, was intensely egalitarian. What happened? And I'd argue it was numbers. I would argue that what actually happened was when we went into civilization and the numbers went up, let's say over 10,000 and then 100,000 and then 1 million, we discovered that the old way of running our affairs, we're all equal, we talk it over and then we get on with it, couldn't be done anymore. 10,000 people can't have a conversation around a campfire. They can't even know what the subject of the conversation should be. And there's no mass media, there's no way of communicating across the thousands or the millions. So the only kind of society that works, and the only kind of society that will work for the next 8,000 or 9,000 years, is a dictatorship, a tyranny, an absolute monarchy, repressive, and very much against our own innate character, I think. So on we go, and history unfolds, and we won't plod through it, but in the end you get down to about 200 years ago, 230 years ago, the first successful democratic revolution, the American one, 1776. Why then, why there, after 9,000 years? And the answer is that the Americans were probably the first society where more than half the population was literate, and the printing press was available everywhere. So by that time, it was possible for the society to communicate, even though there was 3 million of the men. They were able to print Tom Paine would print a pamphlet, and within 3 weeks, half the American population would read it. So now there's a conversation unfolding about who are we and what we want. That's where the revolution came from. And what we were doing there, and have been doing ever since, is reclaiming our real heritage of equality. Democracy is how we make equality work. Voting, division of powers, all that stuff in a democratic system had to be invented once you came up with the idea that you had to have a society where people were equal, and yet it's a big, complicated society, and we're going to have to find ways to make that work. And the Americans did a brilliant job of designing a constitution that's a bit confining 2 centuries later, but pretty good job. But this is not about America. If the Chinese had been the first country to have more than half the population literate and had the printing press, they would have invented democracy. Everybody wants equality. It's engraved in our hearts. And we lived a very long time without it in our lives. And now we're taking it back. I mean, this is actually, in some senses, the last stage of a very miserable story with a happy ending. Thank you.